Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining our UC monthly water webinar. And today I'm really delighted to have Becca Ryals as our speaker. Becca is an assistant professor here at UC Merced, so probably a few doors away from me. But right now she's joining from, looks like from her house apartment. Yeah. Yeah, and Becca's, I think, expertise is really in the area of agroecology, trying to develop climate-smart agriculture solutions, focusing on carbon sequestration, organic waste management, and sanitation. She holds a Ph.D. from UC Berkeley. And I think before joining UC Merced, Becca was at UH Manoa. So my alma mater, that's where I got my PhD. So there is that connection as well. So welcome, Becca. We're really looking forward to your talk. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Safik, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to be talking about the role of soil carbon and soil health in agricultural water management. And I have to admit, it's a bit intimidating talking about this topic with you all because you all are steeped in water. And I'll just, acknowledge that your knowledge is probably a lot more than mine is in this realm. But it's something that I'm trying to fold into my research in more meaningful ways as we develop more carbon farming practices, as we try to better understand carbon dynamics, how they stabilize the climate, how that feeds back to agricultural productivity, and how we evaluate all of these many complicated interactions that happen within an agroecosystem, and how we evaluate trade-offs and benefits. So I'm coming to this conversation presenting some of my thoughts, but really open to discussion and open to learning from you also. So feel free to interrupt me with questions if you have them. And I'll try to monitor the chat, although sometimes it's like hidden on my Zoom so I can see my screen. So feel free to also interrupt and ask questions. We'll also have some time at the end for questions. My key takeaways are right here. Many of you might also be experts in soil health or soil carbon as well, but I'll just want to make sure everybody's starting with the same background. First key takeaway is that soil health is really at the core of productive, sustainable agriculture. A lot of the, we're really good globally at producing a lot of food, but we've seen now that that's come at huge cost to environmental quality, human health, and also social justice. And so soil health is really a central component for when we think about future agricultural systems, both in terms of productivity and also sustainability. And then one particular component of soil health, soil carbon, really plays a central role in how we understand and think about soil health, and also how we incentivize and monetize and give farmers resources for doing practices that promote soil health. And soil carbon has really important implications for water management in ways that I think we speak very broadly about. And understand that important link, but I think there's a lot of room for really improving how we understand those links and where we need to do more work and where we are pretty certain about predicting potential impacts of carbon and water with particular practices. And lastly, I'm just going to share some of the research that we do in my lab. A lot of my lab focuses on the use of organic matter amendments, primarily coming at it from the soil health, soil carbon realm, but again, as I said, trying to really think about carbon farming in a more holistic way. And I'm going to focus on just two case studies, one in a rain-fed system, that's compost application to grazing lands, and one in an irrigated system. This is work that we're doing right now, looking at the use of biochar and dairy manure management. And I'll very just briefly mention at the end that we've got a new project looking at soil health practices in orchard systems. And we're doing some water measurements there, but I'm open to collaboration and ideas if any of you are also interested in those kinds of systems. So first, soil health is really the core of productive, sustainable agriculture. You probably are familiar with the term soil health. It's a bit of a buzzword, but it has a lot of meaning. And I think it's really elevated the importance of soils in meaningful ways, especially in the past decade or so. There's a lot of other ways we talk about soil health. We used to talk about soil fertility, which was a bit narrower, thinking about the lengths of soil processes as they affect crop production. And then soil quality came into our language, thinking about not Hi, everyone. I'm sorry. You probably just lost me for a minute. Can you all hear me again? Okay, thank
Yes,
you.
you're back. Yeah, you're back.
So sorry about that. My power very briefly went out. I thought I just kicked my outlet, so my lights flickered, but it looked like everything went out there for a second. Really sorry about that. I'm going to jump right back on with my screen. Okay, so I think I may have left you on this slide, hopefully. Essentially, the point here is that healthy soils are really core about how we think about our agricultural systems. And embedded behind this really broad description or definition of what soil health is, this continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem, are really components of biological, physical, and chemical functions of that soil. So it's not one thing. It's a broad description, but underlying that is a functioning soil from thinking about all of those different components. When biological, physical, and chemical processes are all operating functionally within a given soil system, we have what we call soil health. And a healthy soil can support a wide range of ecosystem services that people care about, including things like water cycling, nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, the regulation of our Earth's climate, among others. So healthy soils are really vital, and agricultural systems are one type of land use where we have the most direct and immediate impacts on our soil health, either in a negative or a positive way. There are some guidelines that go along with that very broad description of soil health. NRCS has these 5 soil health guiding principles. The first being that diversity is important. They suggest using plant diversity to increase the diversity in the soil. So recognizing that diversity both above and especially below ground are key to feeding the soil, to providing tight nutrient cycles, and those biological, chemical, and physical components of the soil. Limiting disturbance. So here's where a lot of the movement for conservation tillage or no tillage is coming into play, recognizing the importance of soil structure. The third is living roots, basically keeping plants growing or something growing throughout the year, reducing the presence of bare soils that can be vulnerable to wind and water erosion, and having something alive in the soil to keep feeding that soil, especially the biological system. Likewise, soil cover, keeping that soil covered as much as possible so you're reducing erosional losses. And in some cases, integrating livestock into agricultural ecosystems is another way, when done well, to promote soil health. So these are guiding principles and a pretty broad definition. And when it comes to the on the ground aspects, both from science and practice of soil health, it's a really evolving discussion. The way we use these words, the way we think about the frameworks of soil health, and the way we put them into practice are all remarkably still new, even though we've appreciated and known about the importance of soils for a very long time. We're of course building on all of that knowledge, but building it into this broader soil health framework. There are a number of resources out there. So sometimes it can be confusing and overwhelming about where you go. And then sometimes you can find the right resources. There are indicators for rangeland health. USDA has an in-field soil health assessment for croplands. Cornell has developed a comprehensive assessment of soil health, a series of tests that work well for their region in the Northeast. The Soil Health Institute is an organization that's trying to do something like a comprehensive assessment of soil health for all of North America. And they're really diving into the literature and doing a lot of new studies all across North America to provide better data, better information, better integration of existing knowledge to really advance how we think about soil health. And these, I should say, are just a few different kind of assessments that are out there. When we assess soil health, there's not one thing that we can measure, and we can't measure soil health directly. Just like our own health, we can take different measurements, our temperature, our oxygen levels, all sorts of indicators are about our human health. We do that for soils also, because there's not a single soil health probe that you can stick into the soil and say, my soil is 75% healthy or 100% healthy. So this means we really have to understand our context really well, and we have to draw on multiple measures or indicators of properties that a soil has and may change over time or compared to reference sites. And then that collectively, all of that information gives us clues to how healthy functioning that soil is. So this figure right here is just not an exhaustive list at all, but some common measures of physical, chemical, and biological soil health indicators that are done. And the blue behind it has, soil carbon, soil organic matter. Some people can lump that in with chemistry because you measure, an element in the soil, but because soil carbon or soil organic matter really integrates all of those functions, it's kind of an integrative soil health measure as well. There are a lot of soil health policies being implemented in the US and throughout the world. If you are interested in policies in particular, it's a really exciting time to be following what's happening with soil health. And we've seen a lot of activity at the state level in the US in the past few years. This is a map that's produced by nerdsfortheearth.com. Every time I show this map in class, I have to go to the website to make sure I have the most updated one, because these legislations are popping up pretty quickly. The different colors just indicate the level of the legislation. So green would be past legislation that's enacted. There's states that have drafted legislations, but it's not passed, or some activity or other related policies that are related to soil health. As you all probably know already, California has been a leader in soil health policies. There's a number of policies that are soil health related. And there's an entire soil health initiative which supports the Healthy Soils program to provide incentives for farmers and ranchers to enact some soil health practices. There's also a number of policies that maybe you wouldn't at first hand think about as a soil health policy, but they're related to overall soil health goals. Things like alternative manure management programs, for example, could include things like anaerobic digesters or composting, and those materials can be applied to soil. So those are connected in that way also. And there's one specifically for water, the state water efficiency and enhancement program. So that provides financial incentives for farmers and ranchers to implement water savings practices that can have impact on soil health as well. The Healthy Soils program is the one that I'll point out in particular. If you're not familiar with it, this is the program that was created and is run by the state's greenhouse gas cap and trade program. It's distributed $41.5 million since 2016, and that has supported just under 650 projects. The projects include both implementation projects that farmers and ranchers do to implement a new carbon farming practice, or demonstration projects, which are kind of a combination of implementation, but have some research component with that also to test new projects as well. And collectively, those have led to a significant greenhouse gas savings across the state. The way the Healthy Soils program works essentially is that there's a list of about 39 approved practices. These are they have existing conservation practice standards through NRCS, plus a whole orchard recycling that's not an NRCS approved practice, but is with the Healthy Soils program. And these are used in croplands, orchards, and in vineyards, and also in grazing lands. So it's pretty broadly available across different agricultural systems. There are some levels of measurements or modeling included in both the implementation and the demonstration projects. But because this is founded from the state's cap and trade program, it's really carbon focused. So to have an implementation or demonstration project, they have to use the Comet Planner tool, which is a model that estimates greenhouse gas reduction with the application of one of those approved practices. And it also requires some level of soil organic matter or soil organic carbon direct measurements. So of all of those suite of soil health indicators that are available and all those wide comprehensive assessments, that's not really a requirement of the program. It's really based on carbon because of the ultimate goal for achieving the state's greenhouse gas reductions. And so why is that? Well, soil carbon plays a central role in soil health, sometimes because the policy has a particular motive, but also regardless of policies, soil carbon is a really important piece of soil health. And this can have implications for water management. So this is a really lovely figure from Lehman and others that was published last year. The paper is called The Concept and Future Prospects of Soil Health. So it's a really good broad assessment, synthesizing all of those soil health assessments that are available, where they've come from and where we might be going, both in our science and practice of soil health. And so this figure, each of these colored panels shows one function of a healthy soil that we all care quite a lot about. Plant production, we need to grow food, fuel, and fiber from our agroecosystems, water quality, human health, and climate. And across all of these, I'm highlighting here in this red box, the common key property that's an indicator of a healthy functioning soil to attain that function is increase in soil carbon. It's not the only one, but soil carbon, in fact, if you mapped out almost every function of a healthy functioning soil carbon would be on that list. So it's a really important, even though it's not the only one, important indicator for a healthy functioning soil. So that's one reason why the focus is on soil carbon in particular. And there's also, like we saw from the Healthy Soils program through California, there's also an implication for regulation of the Earth's climate. We know that soils play a really important role on the global scale for regulating our Earth's climate. Soils store a lot of carbon, more than all of the carbon in the atmosphere and plants combined. And soils are a dynamic ecosystem of themselves. So this is not, a locked in reservoir of carbon. How we treat that soil really affects whether we're going to see increased loss of carbon to the atmosphere, or if we can restore soil and really maximize and leverage our natural processes to capture more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it into that productive soil. We know that in our history, we've lost a lot of soil carbon. This is a really nice study from John Sanderman and others that was published a few years ago. They used machine learning techniques and soil carbon databases from around the world to quantify how much soil carbon we lost in the last 12,000 years and how that's related to changes in land use, particularly cropland and grazing, the expansion of croplands and grazing. And you can see here that the land area is related directly to soil carbon loss. So we've lost a lot of carbon. There's a huge opportunity to restore those soils to regain that carbon. And soil carbon is a drawdown climate solution. So we know that to meet the urgency of climate change, we have to slow the emissions from fossil fuel sources, new greenhouse gases that are going into the atmosphere. That alone is going to reduce that's going to reduce emissions and slow the rate of change. But we also, in addition to that, need to enact practices that draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put them into soils and vegetation where they can help reduce carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and also contribute to all of those important physical, biological, and chemical functionings of a healthy soil. It's a complicated issue, though. We have so many questions in the soil carbon world about the permanence of soil carbon, how it relates to changes in practices, and how it relates to a changing climate. So that work is not done, but we know enough that we can be sure that we can say it's a worthy investment to implement carbon farming practices. Increased soil carbon is often attributed to increases in production, plant production, but we're still figuring out what the potential thresholds are. So this is a nice paper from Oldfield and others that show there might be a threshold point above which there's kind of a tapering out of the increase in plant production. So as we increase in organic matter, we might not always see linear increases in plant production. That might stabilize over time. And again, soils are a dynamic ecosystem. So this can be because of immobilization of nutrients or enhanced growth of soil diseases like fungal pathogens. But these are relatively high soil organic matter numbers. So I personally don't worry so much about reaching that threshold. I would love for us to get to the point of reaching the threshold to say when is too much carbon so that we're not impacting plant production. In most of our agricultural ecosystems are pretty degraded or have inherently low organic matter content. And so we're operating on this side of that threshold curve. Soil carbon can also improve water quality and quantity. This is a fact that I often share when I'm telling stories about carbon farming. It's a motivation for carbon farming. It's a thought to be a really strong co-benefit of increasing soil carbon because of all of those improvements in the physical structure here shows how increased soil carbon can improve aggregation to have the right kind of balance of micro and macro pores that can retain water and also improve the capacity of the soil to retain that water. But, you know, we often throw around these like wild numbers. So these are just two screenshots that I took from the USDA and from CDFA. Healthy soil, for every 1% increase in organic matter results in as much as 25,000 gallons of available of soil water per acre. And then the other one shows healthy soils can hold up to 20 times its weight in water. Increasing soil organic matter, 1% can increase available water holding capacity by 3.7%. These are great numbers to pitch out there, but I think there's a lot of nuance in what that means. And as we're trying to figure out what practices are optimal for a given context, these are sometimes not helpful numbers to have because it really matters where you are. If you trace back to where these numbers come from, so, you know, some of them come from review papers of available literature, from and then some of them come from kind of like back of the envelope calculations. So this is just to say that we should probably refine these numbers, especially as we're thinking about practices here in California. In what context is this correct? If we're trying to relate our investment in carbon to our investment in irrigation management, these numbers do matter a lot. So I want to talk about the use of organic matter amendments, in particular for carbon farming, and then thinking about what the potential roles are or impacts on water management are. And the reason why this is a good practice to focus on, there's many carbon farming practices, there's many practices that promote efficient water use. But again, going back to this figure from Lehman, across all of these functions, the management strategy that's always listed also is adding organic matter, compost, biochar, animal manure. It's a fast and effective way of increasing soil carbon. Lots of questions about life cycle analysis that we take on in the lab, and we think about, but certainly it's been shown across a number of different systems to be effective. So there are lots of motivations for using organic matter amendments. A lot of the work that I do focuses on kind of the field scale, and farmers might be thinking a lot more about their, you know, their productivity using those organic matter amendments as a source of plant nutrients. But there's also kind of like these higher level questions about waste reduction and circular economies. We're seeing this conversation play out in California with things like SB 1383, which is the organic waste diversion law that's in place now. And again, also policy incentives and climate mitigation goals that are providing new sources of funding for doing these kinds of practices. There are also lots of wasted organic residues that are available for transformation and use in agricultural systems. Just a few numbers to put out there. Human and animal feces is on the order of about 4.6 petagrams per year. Wasted food, 0.93 petagrams per year. Also has implication potentially for forest management, for example, in the Sierra with the drought affecting so many dead trees. These are all potential resources that could be organic resources that could be reused in agricultural systems in smart ways. But organic amendments are not all the same, and so they don't have the same effect on carbon, and they don't have the same effect on water. So it's useful to think about what these different amendments are. So we have these organic residues. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of treatments that they can undergo: anaerobic digestion, compost. They can put on as a slurry. They can be transformed by pyrolysis to biochar. The treatment practice can affect the characterization of the amendments and its effect on a soil system. And so this is just kind of a conceptual figure here with a range of amendments where we can think of manure as having a really high available nutrient load, but a very low relative carbon concentration compared to something like biochar. And we can also think about the ability for that material to retain water before it's applied to soil and how that might play a role when it is applied to soil. Again, with maybe things like compost and biochar having a higher potential to retain water. And then, the application to a particular soil system also gives us some nuance for trying to understand carbon and water dynamics. So the amendment type, the rate, frequency, and method of application, that all of that management component combined with the properties of the soil that you're applying it to, the crop types, the baseline conditions, the climate, time, how long have these practices been going on for? All of those kind of complicate the picture and make those kind of course back of the envelope calculations a little bit hard to put into practice. So I'll talk about two case studies that we're working on. The first is the Marin Carbon Project, and Jeff Creek is here. He was one of the founders of the Marin Carbon Project, so really great to see you, and thanks for coming. This is I'm going to give the kind of the bullet points of a lot of we're now into like year 14 of that project. So these are really the highlights of it. The Marin Carbon Project, if you're not familiar with it, essentially we were looking at the effects of compost application to rangelands. This was a one-time application of about a half-inch compost. Compost was derived from green waste. These were applied in grazed annual grasslands. We collected soils down to 1 meter depth. We did this before applying the compost, and for 4 years after that, or for 5 years after that, and then at the 10-year point. I should also mention the original study was done at 2 locations in the Sierra foothills and then also in Marin County. But now it's been replicated at like 17 different sites across California through the Marin Carbon Project. And there's also been a number of healthy soils demonstration and implementation projects that are also collecting new data all across the state. Things like compost contribute to carbon sequestration. I just want to put this out there because I think it's important, because it's intuitive that these organic amendments have carbon in them. But when we're thinking about carbon sequestration, it's not that you're putting the carbon in the soil and it's locked up and staying there. We really have to think about the full life cycle, what the alternate fates of that material was, and the indirect impacts on the ecosystem. So really, when we're trying to quantify the effects of organic amendments on carbon storage, we're thinking about essentially how does that amendment affect photosynthesis, the ability of plants to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, put it into roots, put it into their own biomass, and basically feed that soil system and create a feedback. And so these are kind of the highlight data points. A one-time application increased forage production. This was especially strong over the first few years. When we got into the drought years, that we saw much smaller effects of the compost, non-significant in those first few years. But then fast forward 10 years later, we still see those differences. And in fact, this year, when we went to sample the biomass, you could still even see visually at the start of the rainy season, an earlier greening up. You can almost trace the plot lines when you were out there, even all these years later, after just that one-time application. This has translated into significant increases in soil carbon. For the first few years of the study, when we were monitoring soil carbon, we detected that change solely in the 0 to 10 centimeters. But now after 10 years, we're starting to also see a significant change in the 10 to 30 centimeters. So I think as this study goes longer, we'll start to see that feedback drawing out in different ways. So the carbon increase is about 8.8 megagrams of carbon per hectare over those 10 years. So that's not a trivial amount of carbon for those of you who think in carbon units. This can scale up. We have in the papers, we have some scaling up for what that number means. And also should mention that carbon can be in different pools of soil organic matter in the soil that are more or less protected. And so we started to see that carbon not only in the less protected, but also in the physically protected pools, which gives us an indication that that has a longer term impact on the ability of that soil to not only retain carbon, but feed back to improved aggregation and a whole bunch of those other processes that we talked about earlier. Soil health policies are increasing the use of things like compost, but there are some stipulations in the policies. For example, the NRCS conservation practice standard that's available right now, it limits the use of compost on slopes that are greater than 8% on rangelands. And for those of you who work in rangelands, 8% is pretty gentle, and a lot of our rangelands, not only in California, but across the nation, tend to be steeper slopes. That's why one reason why they haven't been necessarily converted to croplands. So there's a lot to learn still and a lot to translate into policy. This is a great meta-analysis that was done by Kelly Gravier and others a couple of years ago on organic matter amendments to rangelands. And soil or carbon was a consistent and positive response through all of the several hundred studies that they analyzed. They weren't able to draw sufficient data to draw conclusions about soil water holding capacity. So I think here's where the breakdown in how we really understand the link between carbon and water come to be, and how we generalize across many studies. So that's a limitation. They did find that that organic matter amendments tended to decrease water runoff quantity, but also increase runoff nitrate and phosphate concentration. So there's potentially some things to think about with water quality and water quantity. And this ties back to what that amendment is, how it's applied, and all of the nuances for that practice. We are in the middle of a project that's a healthy soils demonstration project, really trying to better understand that runoff question. We've applied compost to very steep slopes, 15 to 35% in the Altamont Pass up in Livermore, in collaboration with Stop Waste and the Alameda County Resource Conservation District. And the map right here in the corner shows the percent slope, and essentially anything that's yellow would be places that are available for compost application under that NRCS conservation practice. So that's not, oh, sorry, not yellow. And my screen's a little, I've got a bar there. So yeah, the dark green are the slopes that would be available for that conservation practice standard. And that's really like where the roads are, and it's not most of the landscape. And so this would essentially limit landscapes like this for tapping into those resources through EQIP. So we have applied compost. This is a work in progress, and we're making a suite of measurements, but one thing we are including is measurements of runoff and water infiltration. So we have these little runoff collection points at the bottom of each plot. It's a weird scale to work at. For those of you who work on runoff, I would love to talk with you. We're trying to think about how to improve kind of the next phase of this study. But essentially, the past 2 years, we've had very little runoff. These have been super dry years, especially at that site. The average rainfall at that site is about 13 inches of rain per year. Last year, we got just under 3 inches. So there was really not, I think we collected a couple bottles across all plots of very little amount of water. This year, we have some. They're in our freezer in our lab. We haven't had a chance to analyze them yet, but we did have some initial rains at the beginning of the rainy season. So I'm very curious to see what that looks like, both in terms of quantity and quality. Compost is often used to stabilize slopes. So it tends to be effective in engineering practices for reducing runoff and to stabilizing slopes and to holding sediments there. So I think this more data is important to collect to kind of improve the use of that conservation practice standard. Infiltration is something that we've been measuring also. It's hugely a variable across the landscape that we're working in. So it's really hard for me to really draw any conclusions from that. I think that the noise is too much to see a treatment effect so far. There have been some work. This is work by Lorraine Flint and others at the USGS. What she and her team did was try to assess the hydrologic benefit of adding soil organic matter. So this is on the left is a map of soil organic matter across the state, red being very low. Where we are in the Central Valley, we tend to have very low soil organic matter content. And so what they did with their model is to say, well, what if we increase that soil organic matter level by 3% across these working lands? There's a lot that is behind that model. I encourage you to look at their report for the details. But essentially, the conclusions that I draw from reading their work is that the maximum benefit comes from the wetter regions that tend to also have a higher starting organic matter input. And we see kind of a minimum benefit in the Central Valley. And so this, I think when I first saw this, I was like, oh no, this is like where we need those benefits the most for when we're, in the kind of the heart of agricultural production. But there's a few things here. We're starting at a really low baseline soil carbon condition. So I think the challenge is that we need to really kick up the organic matter in these systems. So we need to know more about what practices can do that quickly and to the greatest extent. And then also thinking about all of those complexities with managed water. It's not necessarily just the precipitation and evapotranspiration, but how are we physically moving the water also? So I think there's a lot of questions that this report raises for me in figuring out where we apply certain practices and then how we translate that to things like irrigation management or calculations of recharge to our groundwater and other important water metrics. So that's the quick overview, and then I'll even give a quicker overview of some work that we have in progress. This is the work that we're doing. This is an interdisciplinary team at UC Merced. Engineers, economists, soil scientists, hydrologists, work that's funded by the Strategic Growth Council, and we're using biochar to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane from dairies. And so we're co-composting biochar with dairy manure and also have a land application study that's growing right now. They just did their first mid-season harvest. And we're quantifying the effects on carbon, greenhouse gases, nitrogen, water, and even the economics of these practices. So what we found so far in the composting part of this is that adding biochar to a composting system significantly reduces greenhouse gas emissions. We saw an 81% reduction in methane emissions from the composting process. And we have a life cycle assessment that shows even greater life cycle benefits, especially when we're thinking about the land application side and comparison to alternative practices. So this is really exciting findings, and the moisture of the compost piles played a huge role. I often think about water questions in the soil system, but I've been thinking a lot more about water in the compost ecosystem as well, much more engineered system, but the carbon water dynamics in the compost pile plays a big role into the function of the composting process as well. As I said, we have a field study ongoing now looking at the effects of the compost used in that composting process with and without biochar, and then a mix of the two compared to a control. I don't have a lot of data from that project to share yet, but I do want to say that the field experiment uses one kind of biochar, but we are also doing a whole host of experiments in the lab and future field experiments to look at different kinds of biochar. Biochar can behave differently depending on the feedstock that it's created from and the pyrolysis conditions. So this is just one example showing a water retention curve of several different biochars. And you can kind of see a separation here. These biochars made from almond shells tended to have a higher water retention than those made of walnut shells or almond clippings. We've applied this in the lab setting so far, and this water retention of the biochar itself translates to improved water retention in the soil itself. Application rate matters as well. Higher application up to a point will also increase water holding capacity of that soil. So our field experiment, this is just some preliminary data of soil water using moisture sensors at 7 centimeters and 30 centimeters. And so far, we don't see a big impact of the biochar application on field moisture at those depths. But the caveat here is that so far it's been wet. We've had low evapotranspiration, winter rains, and irrigation events. And in the lab, we tend to see that separation at the lower end of water conditions. And again, only one biochar type. We're doing this more extensively in the lab pretty soon as well. And lastly, just one slide on this, just to say that we are also starting a project in orchard systems where we're doing a whole bunch of soil health practices, compost application, but also cover cropping, reduced tillage, and so on, really stacking all these practices on with controls and trying to understand the impacts on all those soil health indicators. So we have a few more water related questions here. We've got soil moisture sensors, but also things like stomatal conductance. We're interested in water stress of the plants, water infiltration, and also looking at arbuscular mycorrhizae to tie the biological health a little bit more clearly with water use in these systems as well. And if you work in orchards, or if you have any interest in any of these questions, I probably have a lot to learn from you all too in your experience. So just a summary here, soil health, again, is really at the heart of sustainable agriculture. Managing our soils for carbon is important for both soil health and the climate. We have a lot of evidence that shows that organic matter amendments can improve soil water dynamics, but the local context matters, and throwing out wild numbers is maybe a motivation, but we need to hone in a little bit better and trying to understand what that looks like at the site level and how that can translate to a specific farm. So these field scale farming, carbon farming research, I guess this point is more for me. I'm trying to do a better job at incorporating more of the soil water data so that that can improve models, policies, and management suggestions for the farmers who we work with. And I think that's all I've got. Hopefully I'm still here and you're still here. Okay, good. Oh, and sorry, I see the chat.
Yeah, thanks so much, Becca. Yeah, if folks want to, mostly I think there's one question in the chat that perhaps you've answered. So maybe if folks want to enter their questions in the chat, if you're UC, feel free to unmute and ask yourself. But maybe if I could kick it off with a question myself. So I'm an agricultural economist, so a lot of this is new to me. But as an agricultural economist, I'm often interested in studying how policies or different changes are affecting agricultural outcomes and trying to isolate that using observational data. And so soil health might be something that I would be interested in controlling for, so it doesn't, confound the estimation of what I'm interested in isolating. And so I'm wondering if, in tackling that, you've convinced me that, soil health means a lot of different things. And I guess if I wanted to sort of control for these factors that might change over space and over time, at a statewide level, but have fine measurement on a field level, what would be the most salient features to sort of capture soil health if I, as a control variable?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I love your perspective as an ag economist. We have an ag economist on our team for the biochar project, and I feel like I've been learning so much from her team. So I think that, for maybe first understanding who's changing their practices because of soil health, broadly speaking, I think there's probably a way that you can isolate how policy has changed the adoption or implementation of these practices, like for example, CDFA soil health or Healthy Soils program has quickly and largely expanded the use of these practices because they provide dollars for farmers to actually do these practices that might otherwise be too expensive. So that's maybe a motivation, but also things like storytelling are important even without the dollars that come along with it. So neighbors learning from one another, we know that that's a strong part of increasing adoption. That might be a little bit harder to control. But in terms of like indicators that you might include, are you thinking about like what soil health indicators that you can include for that?
Yeah, like what would be the most salient ones that we could measure and observe or estimate at a field level, but for like the entire state, if you wanted to, you're interested in a different question, but you want to control for soil health, like what would I think of first?
Yeah, so carbon is always my go-to one, but I'm trying to be also a little bit more nuanced now. Carbon is just such a good soil health indicator if you only have to pick one, because it really integrates those biological, physical, and chemical components. But I think here in California, things like water infiltration, relatively simple measures of that give you an indication for potential impacts to either water use through irrigation or productivity that might be limited in rain-fed systems. And maybe somebody has a better suggestion too, but I do think in California, because of our Mediterranean climates and our policies that are also restricting groundwater use and things like that for getting to sustainable groundwater management, I think having another, maybe like a carbon and a water indicator might be like the top two things that I might suggest.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Great question.
Okay, so we have a question in the chat from Janet. I'm wondering about the big picture carbon cycling effects. Are the carbon costs of making compost, wood chips, biochar, transportation to processing into farms, and application and maybe incorporation included in your net carbon gain calculations? How much do these contribute to the carbon equation?
Yeah, such a great question. This is where like the life cycle assessment comes into play, both the greenhouse gas carbon life cycle assessment, but also the kind of the economics of it as well. My student published a paper in 2020 that he developed a geospatial model that also had an economic piece called the compost allocation network model. And basically it took the SB 1383 goal. SB 1383 is the organic waste diversion that's limiting our ability to send organics to the landfill starting on January 1st. And so he basically took that goal and said, okay, well, what does that look like in terms of our organic waste that are currently not composted? How far can they be moved outside of more city systems, and how can they connect to farmland ecosystems? And what he found was that the greenhouse gas effect, if part of transportation, is not the limiting effect when we think about the overall life cycle assessment. It's really the cost of that transportation, because it is quite costly to move these materials. But even still, with that kind of that cost limitation in his model, we could make huge gains in the amount of land area that can receive compost. So I think it's an important thing to refine, but I still think in all of the calculations that we've done, even including transportation from a greenhouse gas perspective and from a dollar perspective, it's still net beneficial. And the RCDs that I'm working with have also been doing, I don't think they've published it yet, but they have specifically for compost, from the RCD level, thinking about a compost economics model. It depends on a lot of things. For example, in our steep slope study, We ended up having to use blowers instead of a tractor to pull the compost up because they're steep slopes, and it was just like 2 weeks of rainfall, so it made it a little bit dangerous for the tractors to move. So the blowers were like $15,000 more expensive than the tractor. So there's a few things in the cost calculation that can swing one way or the other depending on your particular context. But like I said, I think in most cases it tends to be net beneficial.
Great, thank you, Becca.
Yeah, and somebody just asked for the reference. I'm happy to send it to Safik, who maybe can send it out to everybody if there's a listserv, but it's by Brendan Harrison and others, and it's in the Journal of Environmental Quality from 2020.
And we have a hand raised too. Do you want to go ahead, James?
Yes, thank you. Great presentation. Quick question. I'm not a farmer, but I own farmland leased out to my neighbor, and it's certified organic. It's had 30 years of bird guano put on it and everything. But this whole idea of char, because I see my neighbors put biochar on there and there's massive clouds of gray smoke all over there, gray dust all over the place. And I'm auditing a class at UC Davis on cultural burning. And if I recall, they said that when you burn, you get more carbon in the ground. So if I have winter wheat on my land and it gets cut, does it make more sense to burn that stubble or just go ahead and plow it in like they've always done?
Oh, so many great questions embedded into that. And I love that you're bringing up the role of indigenous practices, because that is one thing. When I have like my biochar talk, I always try to make sure that I reference that, because a lot of the sustainable practices that we're thinking about now really come from that indigenous knowledge. So thanks for that. So biochar is, any organic material that undergoes thermal degradation at really low oxygen conditions. So burning open is different than making biochar. You get different materials for that. Cultural burning is a really, really important part of sustainable systems as well. So that's, it's hard to give you a one answer for that. It kind of depends on, if you can, what species you have there and how you're doing all of that. But burning is really important part of nutrient cycling and residue decomposition. And biochar is another. I would say they're both two good practices. Biochar works well, especially when you have an accumulation of wasted organic material. We're looking at almond clippings because there's a burn ban is going to be enacted in 2025. So agricultural burning of clippings is not going to be allowed anymore. And so gathering all of those and using a pyrolyzer to make that biochar, which can then be used, is important. But another thing that you brought up so many good things. Another thing is thinking about air quality, right? And so the application of biochar, it's very fine. So we think a lot also about air quality impacts and farm worker health. And so there's people now researching the best ways to put biochar onto a system without impairing the lungs of people who might be doing it.
And maybe just one last question for Stephen. If folks have to go, it's 3:01, but and then we'll wrap up after that, if that sounds good.
Sure, Stephen.
Hi, thanks for the nice talk. Can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you think that the application of urban or dairy compost to rangelands is the best use compared to application to farmland?
Like rangelands versus farmlands?
Yes.
Oh, I don't want to ever put things as a versus because I think we need it everywhere, essentially. I mean, I think here where there's not like one single answer, I think, I think there's probably regional questions about that, where those resources are. Like going back to my student's paper about the compost allocation network model, we need to think about the geospatial connectivity between where our resources are accumulated and where they're needed and how to best get to them. There's benefits from both of those. Rangelands are a really great use of carbon amendments. because they're rain fed. So if there are those benefits for water, especially in drought years, you see that kind of more resilient systems. Farmlands also, especially in the Central Valley, I showed that map of soil organic matter, have really low organic matter. So that's a way to boost carbon in those systems as well, and provide some of those feedbacks and potentially for nutrient availability. So I think they're needed in both systems. And I think that I'm excited about the SB 1383 because it provides us more opportunity for diverting those materials from landfills. I should say, like, landfills, it doesn't make any sense to send those organic materials to landfills where it's just producing methane. So I think there's a nice opportunity that we have here for increasing the expansive nature of how much compost we make and where it can go. So I guess that's like a little bit dodging your question. I think we ultimately need it both in both kinds of systems. And I think it's a hard choice. I guess I'm glad I'm not making policies for making those decisions more concretely. But I'm doing research in all kinds of systems because I think there's questions still about how to best optimize and maximize our use of these organic resources.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Becca. Thanks for the questions, everyone. Yeah, please join me in thanking Becca.
Thank you all so much, and reach out if you want to talk more. I'm always happy to talk about these and learn from you all too. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks for coming.